A tape found 25 years later plays the final words of a missing pilot. The dust was a living thing. It coated every surface in the attic, a soft grey shroud over forgotten decades. Alara felt it in her throat, a dry, gritty tickle that tasted of dead spiders and faded paper. 25 years. A quarter of a century since her mother had sealed this room. This mausoleum of a life she refused to look at. And then, 5 years later, followed its ghost into the grave. Now, with her grandmother's passing, the house and its secrets belonged to Alara. She wasn't looking for anything in particular. Closure was a myth, a word people used when they were tired of grieving. She was just tidying, sorting through the wreckage of 3 generations, her grandmother's wedding, china, her mother's high school yearbooks, and, in a far cobweb-laced corner, a stack of her father's things. Captain Alistair Finch, a name that felt like a headline, not a person. She had only been 6 when he'd vanished. Her memories were fractured Polaroids, the scratch of his uniform against her cheek, the low rumble of his laugh, the smell of jet fuel and cheap airport coffee that clung to his flight bag. That bag was here, slumped against a stack of old aviation charts, its leather cracked and peeling. Beside it was a cardboard box marked Alistair Office. She sliced the yellowed tape with a key. Inside, nestled amongst logbooks and pens that no longer wrote, was a small, plastic cassette recorder, a Sony, the kind journalists used in old movies. It was heavy, solid. A single cassette tape was already inside, its label handwritten in her father's familiar, decisive script. May 11, 1999, pre-flight. The date hit her like a physical blow. May 11, 1999. The day Sterling Air Flight 37. A Boeing 727 flying from Seattle to a remote airstrip in British Columbia. Had blinked off the radar and never blinked back on. The day her father disappeared from the world, her fingers trembled as she lifted the recorder. The plastic felt clammy, cold. Why would this be here? The official report, the one that had been the anchor dragging her family down for years, stated that all personal effects were lost in the crash. Pilot error, the NTSB had concluded. Spatial disorientation in unforeseen, severe weather. No evidence of mechanical failure. They said he'd flown them straight into the granite face of Mount Harrison. A tragedy, but a simple one. An explanation that was clean, sterile, and left no room for questions. But this tape shouldn't exist. Her thumb hovered over the play button. A wave of nausea rolled through her. This was a tomb, a soundproofed, airtight tomb, and she was about to let the ghost out. She could put it back, seal the box, walk away, and leave the dead to their silence. But she couldn't. The not knowing had been a cancer in her family, metastasizing through her mother's hope, then her despair, then her liver. Alara had inherited the disease. She pressed down. The click of the button was obscenely loud in the stillness. For a second, there was nothing but the soft, rhythmic hiss of the tape turning, the sound of empty time. Then, a crackle. And then, his voice. Okay, tape on. May 11th. Pre-flight check, personal log. Alara's breath hitched. Her knees gave out and she sank to the dusty floorboards, clutching the recorder to her chest. It was him, not the faded phantom voice from the few home videos she had, but him here. Now the cadence, the slight weariness, the authority. It was the voice that had read her bedtime stories. The voice that had promised to be home for her birthday. Another run up to the middle of nowhere, he continued, his voice tight, strained. Cargo manifest is creative, as usual. Sterling's little side hustle. A short, bitter laugh. God forbid the man pay for a proper freighter when he's got a perfectly good 727 and a crew he can bully. The words didn't make sense. Side hustle. Bully. She remembered Marcus Sterling from the press conferences. The CEO of Sterling Air, man with a face carved from sympathy and regret. Telling the world how Alistair Finch had been his friend, his best pilot. Ben's done. The walk around, her father's voice said, closer now, more conspiratorial. He says the hydraulics are weeping again. Same portside actuator we flagged last week, last month, the month before that. A sigh, heavy with a frustration so profound it seemed to vibrate through the plastic casing in her hands. Logbooks clean, of course. Ben knows which side. His bread is buttered on. Can't blame him. Sterling's got everyone on a short leash. Static hissed, a sound like frying bacon. Then, another voice, distant, muffled. Al, you about ready? 5 minutes, Dave, her father called back. Then, his voice dropped to a whisper, again, urgent, raw. I've got a bad feeling about this one. The weather's turning, the plane's sick, and the cargo. I took a look. It's not what the manifest says. It's not machine parts. It's chemical drums, unmarked, unsecured. I confronted him about it, Marcus. A long pause. The hiss of the tape was a serpent's warning. Ilara held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. He told me to fly the plane or find a new career. He said some things. Christ. He said this plane, this flight, was worth more to him than my life. He laughed when he said it. The voice cracked, just for a second, a hairline fracture in the granite. I should ground the flight. I should call the FAA right now. But he'd bury me. He'd bury us all. My family. He made that very clear. Ilara was crying now, silent tears tracking clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. This wasn't pilot error. This was a man trapped. A good man being forced to do a wrong, dangerous thing by a powerful man. Okay. Alistair, get it together. The voice on the tape commanded itself. Just fly the route. Get it on the ground. Then, you walk away. You take the journal, you take this tape, and you go to the press. You burn him to the ground. The journal. What journal? The sound of the cockpit door opening, the muffled voice again, closer this time. Time to go, Skipper. Right, her father said. The recording changed. The intimate, whispered quality was gone, replaced by the ambient hum and chatter of a cockpit, the familiar procedural call and response of pilots preparing for takeoff. It was mundane, terrifyingly normal. For 10 minutes, she listened to her father and his co-pilot run through their checklists. Their voices, calm, professional. They were just two men doing their jobs, flying a plane they knew was faulty, with cargo they knew was dangerous, over mountains that tolerated no mistakes. Then the engine sounds deepened. The rumble vibrated through the small speaker, and Ilara could feel the phantom sensation of acceleration, of a great metal beast clawing its way into the sky. She closed her eyes, the attic disappearing, replaced by the image of a silver plane, climbing into a bruised, purple sky. For a long time, there was only the drone of the engines. It was hypnotic. She almost relaxed, lulled by the sound that had been the soundtrack to her father's life. She could hear the rustle of paper, a cough, the click of a switch. Then, a sudden, violent lurch. Whoa, what the hell was that? The co-pilot, Dave, yelled. Turbulence, her father said, but his voice was tight as a wire. No, wait. Shit. Port engines flaming out. A new sound entered the recording. A high-pitched, terrifying alarm, a digital shriek of pure panic. Mayday. Mayday, mayday. Dave was shouting into the radio. Sterling 37, engine failure, rapid descent. We are at 10,000 feet, descending. I don't have control. Her father's voice, strained, grunting with effort. The hydraulics are gone. It's the actuator. Ben was right. That son of a bitch, he knew. The world on the tape was dissolving into chaos. Alarms shouting. The sickening groan of stressed metal. Ilara felt like she was in the cockpit with them, plunging through the dark. She was 6 years old again, and her father was falling from the sky. Pull up, for God's sake, Al, pull up. I'm trying. She's not responding. A new sound, a low, ominous rumble that grew louder and louder and louder. The sound of a mountain waiting for them. Double quotes. Oh God, Dave whispered. It wasn't a prayer. It was a surrender, and then, her father's voice, clear as a bell, cutting through the chaos. It wasn't shouted. It was spoken with a chilling, sudden Calm. The calm of a man who sees the end and has one last thing to say. Elara, he said. Her name, he said. Her name, I love you. Be a good girl for your mum. A choked sob escaped her lips. A sound of agony ripped from her soul. And tell them, he began, his voice rising, desperate, wanting the world to hear. Wanting the black box to record it. Wanting the truth to survive the impact. Tell them Marcus Sterling did this. He knows this isn't an accident. He's sabotaged. It's not just me on this plane. The sentence was cut short by a sound that defied description. A cataclysmic, deafening roar of metal tearing, screaming, disintegrating. It was the sound of a world ending. It lasted for 3 seconds. An eternity of violence that seemed to shred the very air in the attic. Then, silence. Just the soft, gentle hiss of a tape that had been faithfully recording nothing. For 25 years. Elara didn't move. She couldn't breathe. The recorder had fallen from her hands, but the sound was still echoing inside her skull, a psychic wound that would never heal. The official story was a lie. The neat, tidy explanation was a lie. Her father hadn't made a mistake. He had been murdered. And the man who did it had shaken her hand at her mother's funeral, his eyes full of practiced sorrow. The silence in the attic pressed in on her, heavy and absolute. The dust motes, dancing in the single beam of light from the window, looked like tiny floating ghosts. The cliffhanger wasn't on the tape. It was in her heart, a chasm that had just opened up between the life she had known and the one that was about to begin. Her father's last words weren't an ending. They were an assignment. The shock was a physical paralysis, a cage of ice around her heart. For how long she sat there on the floor, she didn't know. Time had ceased to be linear. It was a loop, playing those final shredded seconds over and over. Marcus Sterling did this. The words were branded onto her brain. The world she had constructed around her father's absence, a world of sad accident, of fate, of the random cruelty, of nature shattered into a million pieces. In its place was something uglier, sharper, a conspiracy, a murder, a name. Slowly, painfully, she forced her limbs to move. Her muscles screamed in protest. She crawled across the floorboards, her hands leaving clean tracks in the thick dust. She picked up the recorder. It felt like a weapon now, a relic and a bomb. Her gaze fell on the flight bag again. You take the journal, you take this tape, and you go to the press. The journal. With a surge of adrenaline, she lunged for the bag. The leather was stiff and cold. The main compartment was empty, save for a few stray pens and a crumpled receipt for a coffee. The side pockets held only maps and a pair of worn leather gloves. Nothing. Her heart sank. Had he taken it with him? Was it lost in the wreckage, incinerated on the side of that mountain? No. He wouldn't have. He was too smart, too careful. He had made the tape and hidden it. He would have hidden the journal, too. She ran her hands over every inch of the bag, pressing, squeezing, searching for a false bottom, a hidden seam. Her fingers snagged on a loose thread in the lining of the main compartment. She pulled. Section of the fabric came away, revealing not the bag's outer shell, but a thin, hard surface. A hidden pocket. Her breath caught. With frantic, clumsy fingers, she tore the rest of the lining away, and there it was. A slim, black leather-bound notebook. It was no bigger than her hand. Its cover warped slightly by time and pressure. She lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked. She opened it to the first page. The same handwriting as the label on the tape. But this was not a simple note. This was a chronicle. Page after page of dense, meticulous entries, detailing dates, flight numbers, maintenance discrepancies, and conversations. It was a litany of negligence, a testament to a disaster waiting to happen, and it all pointed to one man. The name Alistair Finch had been a ghost in Elara's life, a portrait on the mantelpiece of a man perpetually 34 years old, forever smiling in his crisp pilot's uniform. The tape and the journal resurrected him, not as a saintly martyr, but as a complex, frightened and courageous man. Reading the journal was like watching him walk and breathe. He wrote with a pilot's precision, but beneath the technical jargon was a current of deep, simmering anger. March 12, 1999. One entry read, "Flew N45 to SA to Denver. Pre-flight showed a slow leak in the number 3 hydraulic line. Reported it to maintenance. Ben Carter, good man, looked worried. Said he'd write it up. Later, saw Marcus Sterling talking to Ben on the tarmac. When I got the post-flight report, the write-up was gone. The log was clean. Sterling is treating these planes like his personal taxi service and the logbooks like fiction." Alistair emerged from the pages as a man who loved the sky but was being poisoned by the company that gave him wings. He was a pilot of the old school, one who believed the machine was a sacred trust between him, his crew, and his passengers. Flying wasn't just a job, it was a moral contract. He documented every shortcut, every falsified report, every time a plane was sent into the air with a known, unaddressed issue. He wasn't just a pilot. He was an investigator, building a case against his own boss. His love for his family bled through the margins. Tucked between notes on engine pressure ratios and landing gear tolerances were doodles of a little girl with pigtails, a reminder of what he was fighting for. Told Ellie I'd build her the biggest treehouse in the world. When I got back, he wrote on the page, dated May 10th, the day before his last flight. Sterling is flying in some bigwigs for his hunting lodge this weekend. Wants the 7-7. The plane's not ready. I told him so. He just smiled. That damn smile. Like a shark. The antagonist, Marcus Sterling, was a different kind of ghost. A public figure. In the 25 years since the crash, Sterling Air had been strategically dissolved, its assets absorbed into a larger conglomerate. But Marcus Sterling had only grown in stature. He was a celebrated philanthropist now, his name adorning hospital wings and university libraries. He was the picture of corporate grace. A silver-haired titan who spoke of ethics and responsibility at Davos. Elara remembered meeting him once, a year after the crash, at a memorial service. He had knelt down to her level, his expensive suit smelling of cologne and power. His eyes, a pale, piercing blue, had been full of what she now understood was not sympathy, but assessment. He had placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. "Your father was a hero, Elara," he had said, his voice a smooth, polished baritone. He fought until the very end. The memory made her skin crawl. He hadn't been mourning a friend. He had been cementing an alibi, performing for an audience of one small grieving child. The journal painted a different portrait of Sterling, a man of blistering ambition and chilling amorality. Alistair described a meeting in Sterling's office, a vast expanse of glass and steel overlooking the Seattle skyline. Alistair had presented him with a list of 6 critical safety failures on 3 separate aircraft. He didn't even look at the list, Alistair wrote. He just poured himself a drink. "Told me that my job was to fly, not to think," he said. "These are my planes, Alistair, my company. They are assets, and I will leverage my assets as I see fit. Your contract is to ensure they are profitable, not to write me love letters about your mechanical anxieties." The final damning entries detailed the discovery of the illegal cargo. Alistair had grown suspicious of the late-night flights to remote, private airstrips owned by Sterling's shell corporations. One night, feigning a forgotten item, he'd gone back to the cargo hold. It wasn't machine parts, it was chemicals. Barrels of them. No labels, no warnings. The smell, acrid. Like poison. This isn't just cutting corners. This is criminal. He's using passenger planes to transport hazardous waste, God knows what else. This is why the maintenance is being forged. No paper, trail, no questions. The hidden witness was just a name in the journal, and a voice on the tape. Ben Carter. Elara found him through the old pilots' union records. He wasn't in Seattle anymore. He lived in a small Rust Belt town in Ohio, a place where people went to disappear. She drove for 2 days. The journal and the recorder on the passenger seat, like a holy relic and its testament. Ben Carter's house was small. Tidy, but with an air of profound neglect, as if the owner had given up on anything beyond basic survival. The paint was peeling, and the garden was a riot of weeds. He answered the door after the 3rd knock. He was a thin, stooped man in his late 60s, with haunted, watery eyes and hands that trembled. When she told him who she was, the blood drained from his face. "I have nothing to say to you," he said, his voice a dry rasp. He tried to close the door. Elara put her foot in the way. "My father mentioned you. In his notes, he said you were a good man." Ben flinched as if she'd struck him. "Your father was the good man," he whispered, his gaze darting nervously to the street. "And look what happened to him." "I have a tape," Elara said, her voice low. Steady, his last words. "He mentions the hydraulics. He says you were right." The old mechanic seemed to shrink in on himself. The fight went out of him, replaced by a weariness that was bone-deep. He stared at her, his eyes filled with a quarter-century of fear and guilt. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, but he opened the door and let her in. The inside of the house smelled of stale cigarette smoke and regret. Ben sat at his small kitchen table, his hands shaking so badly he had to clasp them together. He wouldn't look at her. He just stared at the worn linoleum floor. "He knew," Ben began, his voice barely audible. "Alistair, he knew the whole fleet was being run into the ground. That 727, it was a death trap. The portside actuator for the hydraulic system was shot. I wrote it up a dozen times. Sterling would come down to the hangar himself, pull the page from the logbook, and tear it up right in front of me. He'd look me in the eye and say, 'Is there a problem, Mr. Carter?'" Ben finally looked up at her, his eyes swimming with unshed tears. "What was I supposed to do? I had a wife with MS, 2 kids in college. Sterling owned that town. The union, the FAA inspectors, he had them all in his pocket. If I made a fuss, I wasn't just fired, I was blacklisted. We would have lost everything." He told her about the night of the final flight. It was a story he had clearly replayed in his mind a million times. Sterling was there. He never came for a late-night departure, never, but he was there that night. He oversaw the loading of the cargo himself. Strange barrels, just like Alistair said. He pulled me and Alistair aside, right there on the tarmac. He was different. That night, there was a wild look in his eye. He looked at your father and said, "This is the most important flight of your career, Alistair. See that it gets there?" It wasn't a request, it was a threat. Ben's confession came in fits and starts, punctuated by long shuddering breaths. He told her how, after the plane went down, Sterling's lawyers had descended. They had him sign a statement, a carefully worded piece of fiction that praised the airline's stellar maintenance record. They gave him a severance package that was generous to the point of being a bribe, with an ironclad non-disclosure agreement attached. It was hush money. They called it a tragedy, Ben choked out, a sob finally breaking free. But it wasn't. It was at a disposal. Sterling had a problem, a pilot who knew too much. So he put the problem on a faulty plane, pointed it at a mountain, and let the weather do the rest. He didn't just kill your father, kid. He used the mountain as a murder weapon. The confession hung in the air between them, thick and poisonous. Ben Carter was not a villain. He was a man broken on the wheel of another man's ambition. He was a casualty of the same crime that had killed her father, his life just as surely wrecked, albeit more slowly. He had lived for 25 years in a prison of his own silence, haunted by the ghost of a good man he had been forced to betray. Elara looked at this trembling, broken man, and she felt not anger, but a profound, aching pity. She had found her witness. But his testimony was born of fear, and his silence had been bought and paid for. Getting him to speak in public would be another war entirely. Armed with the tape, the journal, and the location of her witness, Elara felt a surge of righteous power. The truth was a weapon, and she was finally ready to wield it. Her first stop was the Seattle office of the NTSB. She secured a meeting with a mid-level investigator, a man named Harris with a tired face and a demeanor that suggested he'd heard every conspiracy theory in the book. She played the tape. Harris listened. His expression unreadable. He took notes. He examined the journal, turning the pages with a professional detachment. When it was over, He leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Ms. Finch," he began, his tone patient, condescending. "This is compelling from an emotional standpoint, but from an evidentiary one, it's problematic." "Problematic?" Elara stared at him, incredulous. "It's my father's voice. It's his journal. He's describing a crime." "He's describing his opinion," Harris corrected, "a disgruntled employee making accusations against his boss. The tape has been in your family's possession for 25 years. The chain of custody is non-existent. The journal is handwritten. It's unverifiable, and your witness, a mechanic who signed a statement to the contrary and took a payout. A good lawyer would tear him to shreds. So you're not going to do anything?" "The case is closed," Harris said, his voice hardening. "To reopen it, I'd need something more than an old tape and a diary. I'd need new, physical evidence. From the crash site, I'd need a signed sworn affidavit from Mr. Carter. As it is, my hands are tied." He slid the recorder and the journal back across the desk. "I'm sorry for your loss, Ms. Finch, I truly am, but this is a dead end." Elara walked out of the federal building into the rain, the feeling of power draining away, replaced by a cold, sickening fury. The system wasn't just broken. It was a fortress, designed to protect men like Marcus Sterling. Her next step was to go directly to the source. If the system wouldn't hold him accountable, she would. She called office, not as Elara Finch, but as a freelance journalist working on a story about the golden age of Pacific Northwest aviation. To her astonishment, he agreed to an interview. He was promoting a new charitable foundation. The publicity was welcome. Sterling's new office was even more opulent than the one her father had described. It occupied the entire top floor of a skyscraper that pierced the clouds. Marcus Sterling, at 70, was handsome, vital, radiating a predatory charm. He greeted her with a warm smile and a firm handshake, his pale blue eyes twinkling. "A pleasure to meet you," he said, his voice as smooth as aged whiskey. "Please, have a seat. What can I tell you about the old days?" Elara sat opposite him, her heart pounding. She started with softball questions, letting him pontificate about his vision, his legacy. He was a masterful performer, weaving a narrative of innovation and daring. Then, she leaned forward. "I'm particularly interested in Flight 37, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Sterling's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of something cold and watchful appeared in his eyes. "A terrible tragedy. A dark day for all of us. Alistair Finch was a fine pilot. One of my best." The report mentioned pilot error, Elara pressed. "But I've heard rumors that there were mechanical issues with the 7-7 fleet." He chuckled, a dismissive, paternal sound. "My dear, in the aviation business, there are always rumors. It's a high-stress environment. People look for someone to blame. The NTSB report was definitive. It was a terrible, tragic accident." Elara opened her bag and placed the small Sony recorder on the polished mahogany desk between them. "I found something that suggests otherwise." She pressed play. The sound of her father's voice filled the cavernous office. Another run-up to the middle of nowhere. Cargo manifest is creative, as usual. Sterling's little side hustle. Sterling's face became a mask of stone. The warmth vanished. The charm evaporated. The man her father had described was suddenly there, right in front of her. He didn't look at the recorder, he looked at her. It was a look of pure, undiluted ownership. The look a king gives a peasant who has forgotten her place. She let the tape play. Through the description of the faulty hydraulics, the illegal cargo, the confrontation, Sterling remained perfectly still, his hands steepled in front of him. When it reached the part about the final flight, the mayday calls, the alarms, a muscle in his jaw began to twitch. Then came the final words. "Tell them Marcus Sterling did this." The sound of the crash, the shriek of tearing metal, echoed off the glass walls. In the silence that followed, Sterling slowly, deliberately, reached out and pressed the stop button. "Where did you get that?" he asked. His voice was no longer smooth. It was flat, Cold steel. It doesn't matter. Elara said, her own voice shaking slightly. He leaned back, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. It was the smile her father had written about. The shark's smile. You know, for a moment, I thought you were a journalist, but you're not. You're the daughter, Elara. You have your father's eyes, that same foolish fire. He stood up and walked to the window, his back to her. Your father was a good pilot, but he was a sentimentalist. He couldn't see the bigger picture. He thought the rules were more important than progress, more important than business. He was a liability, a small man with a small mind, and he paid the price for it. He turned back to face her. You have inherited his sentimentality and his foolishness. You come here, into my office, with your little tape, and what do you expect to happen? A confession. Tears of remorse. You are bringing a pocket knife to a gunfight, child. He walked back to the desk and leaned over it, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Here is what will happen now. You will give me that tape, and the journal I'm sure you also have. You will go back to whatever sad little life you've scraped together for yourself. You will forget this conversation ever happened. If you do that, you will live a long, unremarkable life. If you do not, I will dismantle you. I will come after your job, your friends, your reputation. I will subject you to a level of scrutiny and pain you cannot possibly imagine. I will do to your life what I did to your father's plane. Do you understand me? The threat was not theatrical. It was a promise. Elara felt a cold dread seep into her bones. She grabbed the recorder and the journal and fled, his low mocking laughter following her out the door. The retaliation was swift and brutal. 2 days later, she was fired from her job as a graphic designer. The reason given was restructuring, but her boss, a man who had always praised her work, couldn't meet her eye. A week after that, she received a notice from the IRS, a full, comprehensive audit of the last 7 years of her finances. Her landlord suddenly found a reason to terminate her lease. The pressure was immense, suffocating. She felt his presence everywhere. A black sedan parked across the street from her apartment. The clicks on her phone line. The sudden, inexplicable chill from friends who were now too busy to meet. He was isolating her, cutting her off from her support systems, making her world smaller and smaller until it was just her and her fear. She called Ben Carter. His voice was a panicked whisper. They came to see me, he stammered. 2 men, lawyers. They reminded me about my NDA. They said if I spoke to anyone, they would ruin me. They mentioned my grandkids, by name They know where they go to school. He was terrified, on the verge of collapse. I can't help you, he sobbed. I'm sorry. He'll kill me. He'll destroy my family. You have to stop. Please, just stop. He's going to bury us all. He hung up. Elara stood in her empty apartment, the eviction notice on the counter, the silence of the dead phone in her ear. Sterling was right. She had brought a pocket knife to a gunfight, and the gun was now pointed directly at her head. The injustice was no longer a historical fact. It was a living, breathing monster, and it was hunting her. The walls were closing. Elara felt the weight of Sterling's power in every part of her life. She was unemployed, soon to be homeless, and utterly alone. The friends who hadn't been scared away looked at her with pity, whispering that she was becoming obsessed, paranoid, that she was letting her grief destroy her. They didn't understand that it wasn't grief, it was rage. She sat in a cheap motel room, the journal and the recorder her only companions. She had listened to the tape 100 times, memorized every line of the journal. She had followed the rules. She had gone to the authorities. She had confronted the villain, and she had lost. Harris was right. She had no new evidence, nothing. That couldn't be dismissed as the fantasy of a grieving daughter. Her hope was a dying ember. She was ready to give up, to pack the tape and the journal away, to find a new city, a new name, and try to forget the ghost she had awakened. Her father's last words, his final desperate assignment, seemed destined to remain a secret. Then, her phone rang, an unknown number. She almost ignored it. Hello, don't talk, a voice rasped. It was Ben Carter. He sounded like he was running. Just listen. I can't live like this. I can't. What he did to your father. What he's doing to you. It's the same thing. He's a cancer. Ben, where are you? Doesn't matter. Listen, I lied to you. I was too scared, but I can't. I can't let him win again. There's more. Something I didn't tell you. Something that proves it all. Ella sat bolt upright, her heart slamming against her ribs. What is it, Ben? What is it? The black box, he said, his voice a torrent of whispered words. The cockpit voice recorder. The NTSB report said it was recovered, but the tape was damaged, mostly unintelligible due to the fire. That's a lie. What do you mean, a lie? The fire wasn't that bad on the tail section where the recorders are housed. It couldn't have been. I know because I was the one who installed that unit. Sterling had bought a new model, an L3 FA2100, top of the line. It had a solid-state memory board, not magnetic tape, and it was encased in a titanium shell, rated to withstand 1,100 degrees Celsius for over an hour. A jet fuel fire on a mountainside couldn't touch it. The data would have been pristine. Ilara's mind reeled. So the NTSB lied in their report. Not the NTSB, Ben said. And this was the twist. The key that unlocked everything. The NTSB never got the real one. Sterling had a man on the recovery team. A local guy up in BC, he kept on a private retainer. They got to the crash site. Before the official Canadian authorities did, they swapped the recorders. They gave the investigators a damaged unit from a different wreck, an old plane that had been scrapped for parts. Sterling kept the real black box. He kept the proof. It was audacious. It was brilliant. It was utterly evil. It wasn't just a cover-up. It was a complete fabrication, a piece of theater so bold no one would ever think to question it. How do you know this, Ben? How can you be sure? Because the night before the flight, I did the final systems check, and I saw the serial number on the CVR unit. I have a habit. I write things down. Always have. It's in one of my old notebooks. From the shop, a pause, a shuddering breath, and I know where he would have kept it. Sterling has a hunting lodge up there, not 50 miles from the crash site. A private place, off the grid. He called it the sanctuary. That's where he took the bigwigs. That's where he took the evidence. He's arrogant. He'd want it close, a trophy. Suddenly, the stakes shifted. This was no longer about a 25-year-old tape and a journal. It was about a piece of physical evidence that could not be denied. An official flight recorder whose very existence proved a massive multi-agency conspiracy orchestrated by one man. The personal pain of her father's death expanded, mushrooming into a public scandal of epic proportions. Ben, this is everything. I know, he whispered. I'm sending you the page from my notebook. The serial number. It's all I can do, after this. They're going to come for me. I have to disappear. For good this time, Ben, wait, but the line went dead. A moment later, a picture message arrived on her phone. A photo of a page, from a grease-stained notebook. On it, in neat, mechanical print, was a date, a flight number, and a string of characters, L3FA2100C, VRSN 774-EO921-10, the key, dot. The next 48 hours were a blur of adrenaline-fueled planning. She couldn't go to the American authorities. Harris had already shown her that door was closed, likely guarded by Sterling's influence. She had to go to the Canadians. The crash had happened in their jurisdiction. The fraud had been perpetrated. On their soil, she found a journalist, not just any journalist, but a woman named Catherine Reyes. A notorious bulldog of an investigative reporter in Vancouver known for taking down corrupt politicians. Ilara sent her an anonymous encrypted email with a single sentence. I have proof that the official report on Sterling Air Flight 37 was a lie. And Marcus Sterling covered up the murder of 25 people. They met in a noisy coffee shop. Reyes was sharp, skeptical, her eyes missing nothing. Ilara laid it all out. The tape. The journal, the story of Ben Carter, the photograph of the serial number. She watched Reyes's expression shift from professional curiosity to guarded interest, and finally, to a state of electrifying focus. "If this is true," Reyes said, her voice low, "this is the biggest story of my career. But we need the box. Without the box, it's still just a story." "It's at his lodge," Ilara said. "The sanctuary." Reyes leaned back, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Marcus Sterling is giving the keynote address at the Canadian Energy Summit in Vancouver in 3 days. He'll be in the country, and his lodge will be empty." The plan they hatched was insane, reckless, and their only shot. While Reyes used her sources to get a warrant from a sympathetic judge in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Based on the new evidence of a fraudulent serial number, Ilara would do the unthinkable. She would go to the lodge. She couldn't be part of the official search, but she could make sure they looked in the right place. Using the last of her money, she rented a car and drove north, crossing the border into the vast, imposing wilderness of British Columbia. She found the unmarked turnoff Ben had described, a dirt road that wound deep into the forest. And then she saw it. The sanctuary. It wasn't a rustic cabin. It was a fortress of glass and timber, a monument to power and paranoia surrounded by a high-tech security fence. She parked a mile away and hiked through the dense woods, her heart in her throat. Getting in was impossible. But as she watched from the tree line, she saw a catering van arrive. Sterling might be away, but his staff was still there, preparing for his return. She saw her chance. Dressed in black, her hair tucked under a beanie, she slipped through the service gate as the caterers were unloading. Her heart hammering inside. The lodge was a temple to ego. Animal heads stared down from the walls, and a massive stone fireplace dominated the central living area. It was silent, sterile. She moved quickly, a ghost in the machine, heading for Sterling's private study, a room her father had mentioned in the journal. The study was locked. Of course it was, but as she was about to give up, she remembered something from the journal. Sterling's ego is his weakness. The combination to his private safe is his first kill. A 12-point buck he shot when he was 16. August 2nd, 1963. The 2nd of August 63, she looked at the electronic keypad on the door. It was a long shot, a 25-year-old piece of trivia. She punched in 080263. The lock clicked open. The study was dark, smelling of leather and cigar smoke, and on the wall, behind a large, ostentatious painting of Sterling himself, was a vault, a safe. She entered the code again. The heavy steel door swung open. It was filled with files, cash, bearer bonds, and on the top shelf, sitting there like a dark idol, was a bright orange box. The cockpit voice recorder, a small metal plate on its side, was clearly visible. SN 774-EO921-10. She didn't touch it. She just took a photo, her hand shaking. This was it, the smoking gun. The truth, preserved in a titanium shell. She sent the photo to Reyes with a one-word message. Found. As she slipped back out of the house, her phone buzzed. It was a news alert from a Vancouver station. Industrialist Marcus Sterling, detained by RCMP for questioning in connection with the 1999 crash of Flight 37. Authorities are currently searching his private lodge. The tension cranked to its absolute maximum. She had done it. She had kicked the hornet's nest. Now she just had to pray she didn't get stung to death in the ensuing swarm. The world erupted. The detention of a billionaire icon like Marcus Sterling on a 25-year-old murder charge was a media firestorm. News helicopters swarmed over the remote lodge like vultures. The photo Ilara had taken of the black box in the open safe was leaked by Reyes, appearing on every screen on the planet. The serial number was a perfect match. The lie was exposed. Sterling, ever the performer, was released after 48 hours of questioning, his high-priced legal team decrying the move as a baseless publicity stunt. He immediately called a press conference at a lavish Vancouver hotel. He intended to control the narrative, to paint himself as the victim of a vindictive, unstable woman and a reckless media. Ilara watched from a hotel room with Reyes as he stepped up to the podium. He was flawless. His suit was immaculate, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He radiated calm authority and righteous indignation. For 25 years, I have mourned the loss of my friends and colleagues on Flight 37, he began, his voice resonating with practiced sincerity. To have that tragedy exploited now, by a troubled individual with a family history of instability, is a desecration. The accusations against me are not only false, they are ludicrous. They are the product of a sick and twisted fantasy. He spoke for 20 minutes, never faltering. He dismantled her character, questioned her sanity, and dismissed the evidence, asked forgeries and coincidences. He was brilliant, convincing. Elara felt a sickening knot of fear tighten in her stomach. Could he get away with it? Could he really be so powerful that even this mountain of truth couldn't touch him? He's good, Reyes muttered, watching the screen intently. But he's arrogant. He thinks he's won. Sterling moved to the Q&A portion. Hands shot. Up across the ballroom, he pointed to a reporter in the front row. Mr. Sterling, the reporter began. The RCMP have confirmed they recovered the flight recorder from your safe, and that its serial number matches the one provided by the informant. How do you explain that? Sterling smiled, a look of pity on his face. A simple matter. That recorder is a souvenir, a memento from a different plane, an old cargo carrier I decommissioned years ago. That it was in my possession is meaningless. The informant, Ms. Finch, has cleverly woven it into her delusion. But it has no connection to Flight 37. He was going to lie his way out. He would create a plausible story, bury them in legal challenges, and walk away clean. Then Reyes leaned over to Elara. It's time. She made a call. At the press conference. The next question came from a journalist in the center of the room, a man Reyes had planted. Mr. Sterling, he said, his voice ringing out. If that recorder is a meaningless souvenir, then you won't mind if we listen to it, will you? Before Sterling or his security could react, the hotel's powerful sound system, which had been discreetly hacked by a contact of Reyes, crackled to life. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. And then, the sound filled the ballroom. Not the hiss of a 25-year-old cassette tape, but the crystal clear digitally preserved audio from a solid-state black box. It was the sound of the cockpit of Flight 37. The effect was electrifying. The entire room of chattering journalists fell silent. On the podium, Marcus Sterling froze. The color drained from his face. This was a sound he had never expected anyone else to hear. It was a ghost from a tomb he himself had sealed. The calm, professional pre-flight checks echoed through the hall. The mundane chatter, the takeoff. Every person in the room was now inside that cockpit with Alistair Finch. Then, the lurch. The alarm. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Sterling 37. Engine failure. Rapid descent. The shouting, the panic, the groan of stressed metal. It was 1,000 times more visceral than on Aileros' little recorder. This was raw, unfiltered terror. Sterling stood paralyzed, his mask of composure shattering. His eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal, and then, Alistair Finch's voice, clear as a church bell, a voice of damnation from beyond the grave. Elara, I love you. Be a good girl for your mum. A collective gasp went through the room, and tell them, Marcus Sterling did this. He knows. This isn't an accident. He sabotaged. It's not just me on this plane. The final cataclysmic roar of the crash filled the ballroom. A sound of judgment so loud it seemed to shake the chandeliers. In the ringing silence that followed. Every camera, every phone, every eye in the room was fixed on Marcus Sterling. There was no escape. No explanation. No lie big enough to cover this. He had been tried and convicted live, on every news channel in the world. By the voice of the man he had murdered. His face, broadcast in high definition on the massive screens behind him, crumpled. The arrogance, the power, the control it all, dissolved in an instant, replaced by the slack-jawed, wild-eyed terror of a man whose world had just ended. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. And then, from the back of the ballroom, two uniformed RCMP officers began to walk slowly, deliberately, toward the podium. The crowd of journalists parted for them like the Red Sea. The only sound was the frantic clicking of 100 cameras. Capturing the public execution of a titan, Sterling saw them coming. He looked from the officers to the sea of accusing faces. And then his eyes seemed to find the main camera, as if he were looking right at Ilara. It was a look of pure, primal hatred. The final glare of a dying snake. The officers reached the podium. They didn't speak. They simply flanked him, each taking an arm. The final cinematic shot was of Marcus Sterling, the untouchable God King, being led away in handcuffs, his head bowed in utter, public defeat, as the voice of his victim echoed in the silent, stunned air. The legal fallout was an avalanche. The black box recording was irrefutable. Faced with a mountain of evidence and global condemnation, the co-conspirators Sterling had protected for decades began to turn on him, desperate to save themselves. His man on the recovery team confessed. Former Sterling Air executives admitted. 2. The systemic falsification of maintenance logs. The story of the illegal hazardous waste transport became a scandal in its own right, leading to dozens more arrests. The Sterling empire, built on lies and bathed in blood, crumbled to dust. Marcus Sterling never faced a jury. 3 weeks into his pre-trial detention, he took the coward's way out. Using a silk tie he had been allowed to keep to hang himself in his cell. He died alone, in disgrace, leaving behind a legacy of ruin. 6 months later, Ilara stood on a windswept bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The air was clean and cold, tasting of salt and pine. In front of her was a new memorial, a simple, elegant spire of polished black granite. It listed the names of all 25 victims of Flight 37. The families, brought together by the truth, had decided against a plaque at the crash site. They didn't want to memorialize the violence of the end. They wanted to honor the lives that were lived. Under her father's name, the inscription read, Captain Alistair Finch, a good man who told the truth, no matter the cost. She traced the letters with her fingers. The anger that had fueled her for so long was gone, burned away in the fire of public justice. In its place was a quiet, profound sadness. She had won. She had cleared her father's name, but it wouldn't bring him back. It wouldn't undo the 25 years of lies. The destruction of her family, the slow, agonizing decay of her mother's spirit. The cost had been immense. A figure approached, walking slowly. It was Ben Carter. He had come out of hiding after death, providing a full sworn deposition that had been the final nail in the coffin. He looked older, but the haunted, hunted look was gone from his eyes. For the first time, he looked at peace. It's a beautiful spot, he said, his voice soft. He would have liked it, Ilara replied. He loved the ocean. They stood in silence for a long time, two survivors of a war that had ended decades. After the last shot was fired, there was nothing more to say. The truth was out. The story was told. What will you do now? Ben asked. Ela looked out at the vast, endless horizon. I don't know, she said, and for the first time, the not knowing didn't feel like a void. It felt like a possibility. I think I'll just live. For him. A plane flew overhead, a silver glint high in the afternoon sun, leaving a clean white trail across the brilliant blue canvas of the sky. For her entire life, that sound had been a pang of grief, a reminder of what she had lost in the clouds. But now, it was different. It was the sound of her father's world, his passion, his legacy. It was no longer the sound of an ending. It was the sound of freedom. She had her father's eyes. The same foolish fire, but it wasn't foolish. It was the fire that burns away lies. The fire that lights the way home. The dusty tape in the attic had not just played the final words of a missing pilot. It had resurrected his soul, and in doing so, it had finally set his daughter free. The lingering echo was not one of pain, but of a quiet, hard-won peace, as vast and as deep as the ocean stretching out before her.